The moment I knew I had made a mistake wasn't when he walked away from me at the courthouse, his designer shoes clicking against marble tile like punctuation to a chapter one never agreed to end. No, the moment I knew, the one that pierced me straight through, was when our daughter looked up at me, barely 2 years old, and asked why her daddy didn't wave goodbye. I had rehearsed 1,000 responses in my mind since the day she was born. Not because I expected to need them, but because I wanted to believe I was raising her in a world where answers would matter, where love was more than a transaction, and loyalty didn't expire with convenience. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it began, when everything still shimmered with the illusion of promise, when I still thought my love could be enough to fix anything that was broken. My name is Maya. I grew up in a town where dreams were whispered over coffee refills and people said someday, like it was a prayer. I had a mother who worked 2 jobs and a father who vanished when I was 7, leaving behind only a stack of unpaid bills and a voicemail saying, "Tell her I'm sorry." We never told him I cried every night for 6 months. So, when I got accepted into a top university on a partial scholarship, I thought I was climbing out of something permanent. I saw education as a ladder, each credit hour a rung I could stand on to see farther than my neighborhood corner store and the dingy apartments lined like dominoes behind it. I chose business education not because I had a deep love for spreadsheets or corporate buzzwords, but because I wanted to build something real, stable, permanent. Something my own daughter, someday, could stand on too. And then I met him, Damien. He walked into my life like he owned the air. That sounds dramatic, I know, but it's the only way I can describe it. He had this quiet confidence, a smooth baritone voice that curled around your spine when he spoke, and eyes that looked right through you like he already knew the ending of your story. He was a junior then, majoring in finance. Came from money, old money, the kind of family that vacationed in the Alps during winter and the Hamptons in summer, and had a guy for everything. I didn't even know what caviar tasted like until I was 19 and accidentally swallowed a spoonful trying to impress his mother at brunch. Damien noticed me in a study hall of all places. I was hunched over a laptop that was overheating on my thighs, editing a paper while sipping coffee I couldn't afford. He slid into the seat across from me with all the ease of someone who never had to work for attention. "I've seen you here before," he said, flashing a grin that made my stomach flip in a way it hadn't since sophomore prom. I didn't even look up. Probably because I basically live here. He laughed, a sound so genuine and warm it made me glance up in spite of myself. That was the first trap. Not the charm. Not the money. Not even the face that looked like it belonged on a billboard selling cologne. It was that laugh. That damn laugh. By our second date, I was hooked. Not just on him, but on the life he let me taste, private dinners, weekend getaways, little gifts wrapped in velvet boxes. But it wasn't just the glamour. What really pulled me in was the way he looked at me when I talked about my dreams. He made me feel seen in a way no one ever had before. "You're going to be someone big, Maya," he said once, brushing my hair behind my ear. "You've got this fire in you. I see it." That was the night I told him about my dream of opening a nonprofit that helped young girls from low-income neighborhoods get into college. He kissed me like I'd just given him the moon. We moved in together the following spring, into an off-campus apartment his parents paid for. I brought my thrift store furniture and dreams. He brought his confidence and 2 duffel bags of designer clothes. It worked. At first. I didn't notice how often I started saying yes instead of no. "Yes, I'll help you with your business proposal. Yes, I'll stay up to edit your deck. Yes, I'll call your contact at the career center. Yes, I'll skip that seminar. I can work extra shifts to cover the rent." Yes, 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 until my own dreams were scribbled in the margins of his. I took 3 part-time jobs my senior year to support us. Waitressing at night, tutoring during the day, and working front desk at a community center on weekends. I kept telling myself it was temporary. Just until his startup launched. Just until things stabilized. Just until he could breathe and repay me in time and love and forever. Then I missed the application deadline for my graduate program. I told myself it was just 1 year. 1 year off to help him. 1 year to build something together. That was the lie I wrapped in ribbon and kept feeding myself every time I broke into tears in a public restroom stall, wiping mascara on a scratchy paper towel, whispering to my reflection, "It's worth it. You love him. He loves you." We were 6 weeks from graduation when I found out I was pregnant. I stared at the test on the bathroom counter of our apartment, the 2 pink lines screaming a future I hadn't planned for. I sat there for over an hour, knees pressed to my chest, the taste of copper rising in my throat. And when I finally told Damien that night, he just stared at me like I'd handed him a grenade. His first words weren't, "Are you okay?" or "We'll figure this out." They were, "Are you sure?" I laughed. The bitter kind of laugh that comes when you realize your life is about to derail and the person next to you doesn't know how to grab the wheel. We told his parents over brunch. Because of course we did. His mother blinked slowly, her pearls practically rattling. "Well," she said, pressing her napkin to her lips, "you'll do the right thing, won't you, Damien?" He nodded. "Of course, Mother." And just like that, I became a cautionary tale served with champagne. They insisted on a private arrangement instead of marriage. Something about not rushing into legal entanglements. I didn't argue. I was too tired, too afraid, too in love. I kept believing if I showed them I was good enough, they'd accept me. I thought maybe if I made it look easy, they wouldn't notice how much I was bleeding inside. When our daughter, Layla, was born, I thought everything would change. I thought holding her would make him remember the vows he never made but promised with his eyes. But all it did was make the distance between us grow wider. He started coming home later, smelling of cologne I didn't recognize and talking about business dinners that didn't match the calendar. I knew, deep down. But I couldn't admit it, not yet. Not while Layla was still learning to walk and the nursery still smelled like hope. And then one day, he didn't come home at all. His mother called me 3 days later. Her voice was clipped, clinical, devoid of the warmth that even strangers offer each other during funerals. "Damien has decided this arrangement no longer suits him," she said, like she was canceling a club membership. "You'll be given 30 days to vacate the apartment. And since nothing was in your name..." I hung up, sat on the floor, and stared at Layla sleeping in her crib, her tiny chest rising and falling, unaware that her entire life had just been rerouted by people who saw her as a stain on a family name. That night, I packed our bags. I took what little savings I had left, withdrew from my final account, and walked away from the life I had built brick by brick with someone who only saw me as scaffolding. I went from champagne brunches to food stamps in less than 3 months. But I survived. I cleaned houses during the day and taught night classes at a community center when I could. I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment with peeling paint and a view of the alleyway, and I made it ours. Layla never went to bed hungry. I learned to braid her hair while she watched cartoons. And every night, I kissed her forehead and whispered, "You are more than enough. This is only the beginning." And they, every single one of them, have no idea what's coming next. They say rock bottom has a basement, but no one tells you how many staircases you'll crawl down before you realize you've been living underground all along. After Damien left, after his family's lawyers slammed shut every legal loophole that could have granted Layla even a whisper of support, I found myself standing in the center of an unfamiliar kitchen, holding my daughter close, whispering that I'd find a way, even if I didn't believe it yet. We were in a borrowed apartment then, a kind neighbor from my waitressing job letting us crash in her cousin's spare unit while I scraped together deposits for something permanent. It was small, barely more than a converted storage room with a makeshift curtain where a door should be, but it was warm, and we were safe, and Layla could sleep without sirens screaming outside her window. I took a job waitressing the breakfast shift at a diner that smelled like old bacon grease and burnt coffee. The uniform was scratchy polyester, 2 sizes too big, with a name tag that read Lucy because the manager said it didn't matter what my name was so long as I smiled like I meant it. I scrubbed booths and carried trays and memorized how every regular liked their eggs. All while Layla napped in a daycare I paid for with whatever tips I hadn't already spent on groceries. The walk to work was 42 minutes each way. I made it every day, even when my shoes split at the seams and my ankles ached so badly I cried in the stockroom between lunch rushes. Still, I never let Layla see me break. At night, when I tucked her into bed, and she asked why we didn't live in a house like her friends did, why our walls were so thin we could hear the neighbors arguing through them, I would press my lips to her forehead and tell her that walls didn't make a home, love did. That as long as we had each other, we were already rich in the ways that counted. I said it with a voice so steady she believed me, even when I was lying through my teeth. There were days I skipped meals so she wouldn't have to. I'd tell her I'd already eaten at work, and she'd nod, never questioning, too young to understand what hunger looked like on my face. I kept a journal during those years, scribbling entries in the corners of receipt paper and the backs of sugar packets, chronicling victories like finding $2 on the sidewalk or getting through a shift without someone calling me sweetheart. With that condescending smirk I'd come to despise. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't fair, but it was ours. Then one afternoon, everything shifted. I was scrubbing a particularly stubborn spot off the counter when the bell above the diner door jingled, and in walked a woman who didn't belong in our sticky-floored little world. She wore a tailored coat that probably cost more than my rent, heels that clicked with confidence, and a look that said she wasn't here for the pancakes. I recognized her immediately. Celeste, Damien's sister. The only member of that gilded family who had ever looked me in the eye and asked me how I was doing without meaning it as small talk. I braced myself for the pity or, worse, the judgment. Instead, she slid into a booth and ordered a coffee, black, no sugar. When I brought it over, she looked up and said, quietly, "You're stronger than any of us gave you credit for." I blinked, unsure how to respond, my hands trembling slightly as I adjusted the cup on the table. She didn't elaborate. She just sipped her coffee and left a $50 tip under the saucer. A few days later, a letter arrived at my mailbox, signed but typed on stationery with a small embossed crest in the corner, an invitation to apply for an adult learner's scholarship through a private foundation. No explanation. Just a deadline and a note that said, "You're already doing the hard part. Let us help with the rest." I never confirmed it was her. She never asked if I got it. But I did. I applied. And 3 months later, I was enrolled part-time in a business program at a local college, my tuition covered in full. I cried the night I got the acceptance letter, clutching Layla against my chest while she giggled and asked if we were going on a new adventure. "Yes, baby," I whispered into her curls. "This time, it's ours." Balancing school, work, and motherhood felt like trying to hold up a collapsing ceiling with a toothpick. But for the first time in years, I felt something spark inside me, something close to purpose. I studied after midnight, surrounded by half-eaten peanut butter sandwiches and Layla's coloring books. I typed essays on borrowed library computers and used flashcards while I folded laundry. And through it all, I taught Layla not just her alphabet and how to tie her shoes, but how to carry herself like her heart was made of steel. She was my mirror, and every time she smiled at me with that crooked little grin, I remembered why I couldn't afford to give up. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Wednesday, hot and humid, the kind of day where the air feels like a wet blanket. I had just finished my shift and was cutting through the luxury mall on my way to the bus stop when I saw him, Damien, standing there in a sleek navy suit, holding hands with a woman who looked like she'd never stepped in a puddle, laughing as if the world had never once betrayed him. I froze. My apron was still stained with ketchup, my shoes soaked from washing dishes, and my hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. I looked like everything he'd worked to forget. He didn't see me at first. But she did. She gave me that once-over glance, the kind that starts at your shoes and ends at your soul, and leaned in to whisper something in his ear. When he turned, our eyes met, and for a moment, just 1 second, I saw something flicker there. recognition, regret, maybe even shame. But then he looked away, adjusted his cufflinks, and kept walking. No words, no acknowledgement. Not even for the daughter he hadn't asked about in 5 years. I made it to the restroom before I let the tears fall. I locked the stall, covered my mouth, and cried until I couldn't feel my knees. But when I walked out, I stood straighter. That moment didn't break me, it clarified me. I had spent so long waiting for closure, for an apology, for something to make the pain worth it. But standing there in my uniform, humiliated and invisible, I realized I didn't need his recognition. I was raising a brilliant, kind-hearted young woman who didn't carry the weight of her father's absence like a wound, but wore her resilience like a crown. Layla was 12 when she got her first academic scholarship. She handed me the envelope at dinner, her eyes wide with disbelief, and I remember thinking she was growing up too fast. She was already taller than me, her curls longer, her voice firmer, but she still looked at me with the same reverence she did as a toddler. "Mom," she said, her voice shaking, "they want me to start early. A prep program for the top high schools. They said I'm gifted." "You are," I told her, voice cracking, "and don't you ever let anyone make you feel like you're not." From that moment on, she soared. Science fairs, debate tournaments, writing contests, she devoured them all. And I cheered her on at every step, even when my feet were blistered from 12-hour shifts, even when I had to borrow a neighbor's iron shirt just to look presentable at her school events. Years passed in a blur of late-night study sessions and second-hand textbooks, and somehow, I finished my degree the same year she graduated high school. We walked across our stages within weeks of each other, and when she got accepted into Yale, I wept like I'd been given a second chance at life. We celebrated with boxed pizza and dollar store streamers because that's what we could afford, but the joy in that room was more luxurious than any chandelier-lit gala I had ever suffered through with Damien. I still waitress sometimes. Even with my degree, job offers are slow and Layla's tuition isn't cheap. But now, when I walk into that diner, I do it with my head high and my name, my real name on my chest. I built this life from the ashes of someone else's ambition, and no one gets to tell me it's not enough. Celeste still sends cards every Christmas. Always unsigned, always unspoken, but inside them are bookstore gift cards and once a note that read simply, "She's her mother's daughter. The world is better for it." And I believe that. With all my heart, I do. Because resilience isn't a loud declaration, it's the quiet, daily defiance of falling and rising, again and again. It's sitting across from your past and refusing to let it define your future. It's whispering to your child in the dark, "I've got you," and meaning it, even when you're unsure how you'll manage the next day. But most of all, resilience is love, raw, unfiltered, and forged in fire. And that's something Damien's family will never understand, no matter how many trust funds they pass down. There are moments in life that feel like carefully staged plays, where every chair is positioned with purpose, every smile conceals a blade, and every word spoken is just another line in a script you didn't write but are expected to perform flawlessly. The invitation arrived embossed in gold foil, as if extravagance could soften history. Please join us in celebrating Layla Carter's graduation from Yale University. Dinner and remarks to follow. Black tie requested. It came in a thick envelope with no return address, but I knew exactly whose fingers had chosen the paper, whose voice had dictated the phrasing, whose wealth paid for the postage. It was from Damien's family. I held the card between my fingers like it might combust. For a moment, I considered tearing it in half and pretending it never existed. But then I thought of Layla, my daughter, my everything, smiling as she crossed that stage, diploma in hand, eyes full of the kind of fire I used to carry before the world tried to drown it out. She had worked so hard, climbed mountains with bare feet, not knowing her mother had once knelt on broken glass just to build the path. So I RSVP'd yes. Not because I wanted to. Not because I owed them. But because Layla deserved to have someone in that room who saw her accomplishments not as accessories to a wealthy name, but as the legacy of survival, sweat, and soul-crushing sacrifice. The venue was absurd. A private dining hall nestled in the hills just outside New Haven, with valet service that smelled like fresh eucalyptus and a chandelier so large it looked like it required its own zip code. I arrived in the only dress I owned that could pass as formal, a navy blue sheath I'd found at a thrift boutique 2 towns over, altered with trembling hands on a sewing machine older than my daughter. I had done my hair myself, worn shoes that pinched at the heel, and painted my nails in the same shade Layla used for her school colors. When I walked in, I felt every pair of eyes slide toward me like ice cubes down a silk blouse. They didn't stare, not directly. That would have been too obvious. No, they did something worse. They acknowledged me the way people do a leak in the ceiling during a fancy dinner party, subtly, but with enough judgment to chill the air. Celeste was already there, standing near the fireplace, dressed in a tailored plum pantsuit that looked like it had walked out of a Vogue editorial. She saw me immediately. Her face softened for just a second before she returned to sipping her wine, eyes scanning the room like she was preparing for war. Damien and his parents were fashionably late. They arrived with their usual fanfare, chauffeur-driven car, whispered announcements, and the subtle rustle of designer fabric. Damien's new wife, Juliet, wore an emerald gown that clung to her like envy incarnate, her hair pulled into a bun so tight I wondered if she could blink without permission. His father, Malcolm Carter, stood like a CEO at a shareholders' meeting, every inch of him exuding the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. And then there was Damien. Polished, poised, perfect, not a hair out of place, not a wrinkle in sight, not a trace of the boy who once cried in my arms because his pitch was rejected by an investor who called him immature. He kissed Layla on the cheek, posed for photos, and pretended the first 18 years of her life hadn't happened without him. The dinner began with polite conversation. Appetizers were served by gloved waiters who barely spoke above whispers. Layla was glowing, fielding compliments and congratulations from distant relatives and socialites who now claimed to have always believed in her brilliance. She thanked them graciously, unaware that most of them had referred to her as that girl behind her back, just a complicated footnote in Damien's otherwise glossy biography. I sat at the table reserved for close family, strategically placed at the edge of the room, close enough to include, but far enough to distance. Juliet gave me a strained smile as she commented on the bravery it must have taken to raise a child so independently. I smiled in return. Bravery is just love with scars, I said, and watched her blink in confusion before retreating behind a sip of her overpriced wine. It was during the second course that the real performance began. Malcolm leaned across the table, dabbing the corner of his mouth with a linen napkin, and said in a tone so smooth it might as well have been venom, "You must be very proud. It's not often that a single mother can raise a child with so much poise." I nodded slowly. Pride doesn't begin to cover it. Layla is a miracle built on midnight shifts and broken dreams reassembled with bare hands. He chuckled, like I'd told a joke. Well, you know how it is. We all do our part. Damien certainly provided when he could. And of course, stability was key. Funny, I said, because Layla's idea of stability was me choosing between electricity or groceries some months. Juliet interjected quickly, her voice feigned concern. "Oh, I'm sure you managed. You seem resourceful." The knife they handed me with the steak felt like a prophecy. Still, I stayed calm. I sipped my water. I smiled. I endured. Until Damien's mother, Eleanor, turned to me with that same smile she had worn the day she told me I was unsuitable for their family and said, "We've all made sacrifices, dear. But let's not pretend yours were unique. Layla's success is due to her bloodline, after all." The words hit me like a slap I didn't flinch from. I opened my mouth to speak, to finally let loose the years of silence wrapped around my throat like a noose. But before I could, Celeste stood. She didn't raise her glass. She didn't wait for applause. She simply walked to the center of the room and tapped a knife against the edge of her water glass. The room quieted instantly. "I have something I need to say," she began, voice unwavering, eyes fixed not on me, but on the entire family seated in opulence around the mahogany table. "Tonight is a celebration of Layla's achievement. But it is also, whether any of you like it or not, a celebration of Maya." Whispers rippled through the room like a dropped wine glass. "Let me be very clear," Celeste continued, her voice now rising. "This woman raised a child alone, with no help, no safety net, no apologies from the man who helped create her, and then abandoned them both. She worked 3 jobs while attending night school. She skipped meals to feed her daughter. And the reason Layla Carter exists, as she is now, brilliant, bold, and unstoppable, is because Maya refused to break when every one of you stood by and watched her bleed." Damien stood, his face pale. "Celeste, that's enough." "No," she snapped, eyes blazing. "You don't get to tell me when enough is enough, Damien. Not after everything." She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, then held it up. "This," she said, "is the original business plan for your first startup. The one you pitched in senior year. The one you now claim as the cornerstone of your empire. You know why I have it? Because Maya wrote it. Every word. Every financial projection. Every pitch deck. You took it from her. You ran with it. And when it succeeded, you erased her." The silence in the room became a vacuum. Celeste's voice cracked for the first time. "I've stayed silent for years because I didn't want to ruin the illusion. But Maya, you deserve to know, I was the one who paid your tuition. I funded that scholarship through an anonymous foundation because I believed in you more than I ever believed in the legacy of this family." Gasps erupted. Juliet turned to Damien, horror blooming across her face. "Is that true?" Damien's jaw clenched. "It was a collaboration." "No," I said quietly, finally standing. "It was theft. And now everyone knows." Celeste stepped closer, her voice softening. "You taught me what strength looks like, Maya. Watching you survive, no, thrive, showed me I didn't have to live under the Carter name to matter." Then, without missing a beat, she turned to her partner, a woman in a sleek black suit who had been quietly standing near the back, and knelt. There were audible gasps as Celeste pulled out a ring. "In a room full of liars, thieves, and hypocrites," she said, "you are my truth. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in my eyes before I could stop them. The woman nodded, and Celeste stood, turning back toward the room. Tonight was meant to be about celebration. And it is. But let's celebrate the right people. The ones who build instead of take. The ones who nurture instead of judge. The ones who survive and then choose to love anyway. The applause was hesitant at first, then louder. Genuine. From the staff. From distant relatives. From people who saw what had just unraveled and knew it was long overdue. I looked at Layla. She was crying, hand pressed to her mouth, eyes fixed on me. "Mom," she whispered, "why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because I wanted your wings to be your own," I said. "Not something you thought you owed me." She shook her head, came forward, and wrapped her arms around me so tight I thought my ribs might shatter, but I welcomed the pain. Because for the first time in 2 decades, I wasn't surviving a room. You would think that after the truth is spoken, after the mask is ripped off and the crowd finally sees what's behind it, there would be applause. That people would gather around the fallen liar and make him face the debris of his legacy. That there would be justice. Immediate. Poetic. But the truth, I've learned, rarely gets a standing ovation. It just lingers, heavy in the air, waiting for someone brave enough to breathe it in. The morning after that dinner, I woke up not in my apartment, but in a guest room at Celeste's brownstone, sunlight pouring through gauzy curtains and the scent of fresh coffee floating up from the kitchen. I hadn't planned to stay. I'd only followed her there because Layla begged me not to return home alone, her eyes still puffy from crying, her voice trembling when she asked, "Can we all just be together for one night, like a real family?" So I stayed. Not because I wanted comfort, but because I couldn't bear to see her look at me with awe and not give her at least one more night of soft things. Celeste didn't come upstairs that night. She didn't try to talk, didn't demand an apology or a debrief. She just left a folded blanket on the end of the couch and a glass of water on the nightstand, like she'd known I would need both, but hadn't assumed she had the right to say so. It was the first time I slept through the night in months. The fallout was exactly what you'd expect if you've ever watched a house of cards collapse in slow motion while the people inside scramble to pretend the wind doesn't exist. By Monday morning, the Carters had removed all posts about the graduation dinner from their social media. Their publicist issued a vague statement about private family matters and celebrating Layla's accomplishments in a more intimate setting. Damien disappeared from the media for a full 2 weeks. Rumors swirled. Investors whispered. Partners asked quiet questions behind closed doors, the kind that didn't need answers because the silence spoke volumes. But none of that mattered to me. What mattered was the look in my daughter's eyes as we sat in a quiet cafe 2 days later, her fingers wrapped around a coffee mug she wasn't drinking from. "You should have told me sooner," she said, not with anger but with sorrow. I could have helped carry it. I reached across the table, touched her hand gently. "I wanted your shoulders free," I said, my voice tight, "so you could fly without my bruises weighing you down." She cried, silently, her tears falling into her untouched cappuccino. And I let her, because she needed to grieve the image she'd clung to, the sanitized story of a father who had simply drifted and a mother who had made it look easier than it ever was. Celeste came back into my life the way dawn breaks, a slow gradient of warmth you don't realize is surrounding you until the darkness is fully gone. She didn't push. She didn't demand forgiveness or define our relationship by a label I wasn't ready to say out loud. Instead, she started showing up. With groceries. With books. With ideas. With memories I didn't realize she had collected, quiet moments from years past when I hadn't even known she was watching. "I used to see you at campus," she said one night as we sat on her rooftop under a sky that was more stars than clouds. "Back when Damien first started that business. I remember watching you in the library, red pen in one hand, baby bottle in the other. You looked like you were about to conquer the world and cry at the same time." I laughed. "I couldn't help it. And I fell in love with you right then," she said, her voice low. Not in a lightning bolt way. Not all at once. It was like watching a fire grow. Quiet, then roaring. I looked at her, unsure if I could carry that kind of devotion. "Why didn't you say anything back then?" I asked. She smiled, sad and knowing. "Because I thought you deserved someone who hadn't been raised in the same house that burned you." That was the night she kissed me. Gently. No hunger. Just reverence. Like she was asking, not taking. And I let her. But the next morning, as I stared at myself in the mirror above her sink, I felt the old weight crawling back, the voice in my head whispering that I didn't deserve good things unless I bled for them first. I left before she woke up. I didn't return her texts for 3 days. Not because I didn't want her, but because I didn't know how to believe that wanting wasn't the same thing as being a burden. It took an email to snap me out of it. From a woman named Dr. Lillian Ortega, founder of a progressive startup incubator for women entrepreneurs. She had seen a video from the graduation dinner, one that had gone viral without our permission, recorded on someone's phone, Celeste's speech played over and over again by women who had also been erased from the narratives they built. Dr. Ortega wanted to meet. She had read the original business proposal, had tracked it back to my IP address through archived files on the Carter Company servers. And she had a proposal of her own. "We'd like to offer you a partnership position," she said when we met. "To lead an incubator for women like you, single mothers, overlooked innovators, people with brilliant minds, but no institutional backing. We don't want your pain. We want your fire." I said yes before I could second-guess myself. The next week, I gave my first public talk at a local women's leadership conference. The room was packed: students, entrepreneurs, activists. And when I stepped onto that stage, I didn't carry shame anymore. I carried a story forged in sacrifice, resilience, and love that refused to die. I used to believe that love was a transaction, I said into the microphone, my voice clear. That if I just gave enough time, labor, forgiveness, I'd eventually be allowed to receive it. But love isn't earned through suffering. It's chosen. It's offered. It's shared. When I stepped off stage, Layla hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. You were everything they said you weren't, she whispered. And everything I want to be. I moved in with Celeste a month later. Not because I needed her house or her resources or even her safety, but because she made space for me to be loved without disclaimers. Because she let me take up room and never once acted like I owed her rent for it. We hosted our first dinner party on a Saturday evening. Nothing fancy, just lasagna, salad, and old vinyl records spinning in the background. Layla brought her girlfriend, a bright-eyed architecture major who told me she wanted to design housing for single mothers someday. I smiled so hard my cheeks ached. At the end of the night, Celeste found me on the back porch, staring up at the stars. I keep thinking it'll vanish, I said. This peace. This fullness. She wrapped her arms around me from behind, rested her chin on my shoulder. It won't vanish, she said. Because you didn't steal it. You built it. And it's yours. Sometimes I still wake up in a panic, reaching for the version of me that used to survive by planning exit strategies in her sleep. But then I feel her hand on my back or hear Layla laughing from the kitchen, and I remember I'm not on fire anymore. I'm blooming. If you had told me 5 years ago that I'd someday be sipping coffee beside my wife while our daughter organized a youth mentorship table for incoming grad students, I might have laughed, loud and bitter, like someone choking on the smoke of their own burned life. But here I was, watching sunlight reflect off Yale's stone towers while Celeste adjusted her sunglasses, and Layla directed a dozen first years with the calm authority of someone who knew she had already lived 3 lives before turning 24. My wife nudged me with her shoulder, smiling like she always did when she caught me staring. You're doing it again, she said, raising an eyebrow. Doing what? I asked, pretending not to know, even as the lump in my throat returned like it always did when I paused long enough to feel joy. That look like you're trying to memorize this moment so hard it turns into stone, she replied. You don't have to. It's real. It's yours. You don't have to earn it anymore. I closed my eyes for a beat, breathing in the air scented faintly with late summer grass, fresh brewed espresso, and a future I had built not from scratch, but from ash. We'd come to New Haven for Layla's graduate orientation. She was starting a dual-degree program, education and public policy, and had already secured a position in a student think tank focused on accessible learning pathways. She wore her lanyard with the kind of pride that made my chest ache, not from regret, but from awe. At the welcome reception, she introduced us like it was the most natural thing in the world. This is my mom, Maya, she told the woman at the welcome table, and this is my other mom, Celeste. They run the Phoenix incubator together. Celeste smiled. I nodded. But inside, something small and trembling lit up. Not because I needed the world to validate me, but because my daughter did it without thinking twice. That night, we returned to our new home on the outskirts of Boston, a restored townhouse filled with mismatched furniture, succulents in recycled tea tins, and books piled in every corner like we were building fortresses out of knowledge. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't spotless. But it was ours. Every floorboard creaked with the sound of second chances. Celeste had left the Carter family name behind in every way that mattered. She now went by Celeste Rains professionally, a name she said felt more like soil than silver, something she could plant into. I never asked what it cost her to walk away from that dynasty, but I saw it in her eyes when mail arrived from someone still clinging to the wreckage of what they used to be. We were launching the next phase of the Phoenix incubator that fall, a partnership with 3 community colleges, 2 women's shelters, and an urban arts collective. The model was simple: support ideas from the people who had been shut out of the system, then get the system out of their way. I wasn't just a co-founder now. I was a keynote speaker, a mentor, a board member, a woman who walked into rooms without apologizing for her existence. The event was held at a repurposed opera house in the heart of the city, its gold trim and velvet seats now belonging not to galas, but to dreams. I wore a suit, tailored, bold, deep plum to match Celeste's eyes, and a pair of heels that made me 2 inches taller than the woman who still left love notes in my coat pockets when I had early meetings. As I waited backstage, a young intern handed me a program. On the inside cover was my face, not beside Damien's. Not under a "Women Behind the Men" tagline. Just me, with the title, Building What We Were Told to Survive. When I stepped onto the stage, the applause started before I opened my mouth. But it wasn't until I saw Layla in the 3rd row, smiling, hand resting on Celeste's shoulder, that I finally let myself believe it was all true. 10 years ago, I began. Voice steady, I stood in a diner bathroom and cried so hard I thought my ribs might collapse. I was wearing a uniform that didn't fit, my shoes were soaked in someone else's coffee, and I had $15 to my name. My daughter was 2 years old, and I had just seen her father walk past me in a designer suit, holding another woman's hand, without so much as a glance in our direction. Silence. Not pity, not horror. Just silence. The respectful kind, the kind that waits. Back then, I thought my life was a footnote. I continued. A cautionary tale. A woman who loved too hard, trusted too deeply, and paid too dearly. I paused, looked around. But it turns out, I said, voice thickening, I was the prologue. Not to someone else's story, but to my own. The rest of the speech was a blur. Statistics about gendered funding gaps, stories from women in our incubator, calls to action for more radical equity. But it ended with this. I didn't just raise a daughter. I raised myself from the wreckage, and I built a home out of the rubble they left behind. Standing ovation. Later that night, back at home, we cooked dinner together, nothing fancy, just roasted chicken and rosemary potatoes, Celeste's favorite. Layla peeled carrots while balancing a laptop on her hip. I set the table, placing the silverware with the kind of precision that comes from years of trying to make something feel elegant even when it wasn't. We ate by candlelight, not for romance, but because the power had flickered earlier during a storm and none of us had felt like fixing it. We laughed. Loud, open-throated, wine-drunk laughter. Celeste teased Layla about her clumsy knife skills. Layla teased me about my terrible karaoke voice. And when Celeste reached over, brushed a crumb from my cheek, and kissed me with that casual, practiced intimacy that comes from building love brick by brick, I didn't flinch. I didn't shrink. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't performing for a seat at the table. I was the damn table. And when I looked across it at my daughter, radiant with her own legacy, and my wife, fierce and steady as the moon, I didn't feel gratitude or surprise or disbelief. I felt home. No contracts. No debts. No illusions. Just 3 women who had learned that family isn't defined by the name on your birth certificate, but by the hands that catch you when you fall, the voices that remind you who you are, and the love that stays when the spotlight fades. And as the candles burned low and the music faded into quiet, I whispered the final truth I had waited my entire life to say aloud. I didn't just raise a daughter. I raised myself from the wreckage. And this time, I said it with pride.